first episode of Back to the Future, where we discuss how some geoscience exploration technologies of old have come back in a big way. Today, we're joined by Eric Street, the Marty McFly of our episode. Eric received his geology degree at Simon Fraser University, where he was the recipient of 5 undergraduate awards and has led geoscience projects domestically and internationally. He is now the Director of Geosciences at Carbon Alpha. Carbon Alpha is a leader in CCS project management and execution. And great Scott, we are lucky enough to have the Doc Brown of geoscience, Mr. Lee Hunt. Lee needs no intro, but I will give one anyway. He's received many accolades for his work in geoscience, including the 2020 CCG Symposium honoree and the CCG Meritorious Service Award. He is currently a technical advisor in the Carbon Alpha subsurface team. We also have Paige Mamer, the marketing genius behind SeisWare. Paige received her master's at Queen's University in structural geology and geophysics. With her impressive background, she has transitioned her focus to marketing, helping communicate the incredible value of geoscience to the world. And lastly, I'm Austin Newman, an account manager at SeisWare with a much less impressive resume than the other members of this episode. Education from the University of Alberta with a background in geophysics. So hopefully I can keep up in today's interesting discussion. On that note, Paige, what are we discussing today?
Well, thanks for the intros, Austin. Today we are going back to the future with 2D. And to give everyone some background on how this Back to the Future theme came about, we all had a discussion on seismic data types, 2D in particular, and this was around the time that Lee and his co-authors had submitted some articles to the CSEG that touched on the same subject. So those are available in the recorder, and I encourage everyone to read them. But we thought it was interesting that 2D, which was once very popular but gave way to 3D seismic, seems to have hopped in a DeLorean, hit the gas, and has made a reappearance in today's carbon capture and storage work. So Lee, tell us, why did 2D go out of style?
Sure, Paige. There's not really a single answer to that question. So we're going to break it up and explore it from multiple perspectives, one of them being technical capability, secondly, economic factors, and thirdly, geological factors. But let's start with the technical challenges, because really we're talking about at one time there really was only 2D. And part of it going out of style was that you actually could shoot 3D. So we have to look at the obstacles that were in the way of this. Overarching in our explanation of why 2D went out of style, maybe we'll think about it as getting murdered. Like a crime, and it requires a motivation, a means, and an opportunity for this crime of the 2D murder to have taken place. So we need those 3 conditions to get rid of 2D, but really you need them to get anything done. If there's going to be a decision or an action made, you kind of need those 3 things. And here we're talking about a sea change in seismic method. So yeah, not just about shenanigans, motivation, means, and opportunity. Back to the technical challenges. The technical aspects of this really involve the means and opportunity of replacing 2D. So really we're talking about how it was 3D, how did it evolve? We need to learn how to shoot 3D, what the design might look like. Originally, the very first 3Ds, we didn't have channel capacity, not just channels in the but instrumentation that could have a big recording system. So that channel count had to change. We needed new instruments. Eventually, when we started getting those things, led to the arguing and debating over 3D designs, which actually is still going on today and is quite fun. Eric and I are working on a little project with design work right now, and it gets deep real fast. So that's sort of the instrumentation field part of the technical challenges. We also had to learn to process this data. And that meant developing algorithms that could manage and take advantage of the new higher domains that exist in a 3D survey. Initially, we weren't very good at those things, but we had to get there. We had to learn how to attenuate noise in 3D domains to both conversely find and emphasize signal. But also to do all those things, we had to develop computational power to process that data. And if we were a new person starting out now, you know, we come with the assumption of capability on the computational side, but this was not always the case. If you go back and look at the radon transform invest that Hampson Russell put together, there were some real tricks that they had to pull off just to be able to make that radon transform work at the time. So it was with all 3D, you had to be very clever. And given who I'm talking to, I should not miss talking about software development. So you needed to be able to shoot something in the field, you needed to be able to process it, and you needed to have some kind of software to look at all this data, because really back, even in the 80s, people did a lot of their work on paper. And sometimes they would measure timing lines, and we started getting workstations for 2D interpretation, but they were used in a kind of minimal way. But now you've got 3D data, there's so much more. Software needs were really important. Ultimately, it's probably easier to code software for 3D than it is for 2D. I think it's way more tricky handling a pickup stick scheme. That is, it's easier to code if it's already been done. The first time, not so easy. And there was a time when there was no 3D or 3D software. Lastly come people like Eric and myself on the other end of using the data. We had to learn how to interpret 3D data, and that included visualization techniques. Computational capability, again, comes back into this. We had to develop and use graphical handling for the information. So one answer is that 2D went out of style because we overcame certain technical challenges required to use 3D. In other words, we had a choice. What's the other two aspects of this? One of them is economics. And we would say that turning your back on economics is like turning your back on the ocean. Economic influences are always a factor. And going back to the motivation, means, and opportunity for murdering 2D, economics play a part in the motivation and opportunity for making a change from 2D to 3D. On the opportunity side, we've talked a little bit about the equipment and computational power. Well, not only did you need to have those things, but you need to be able to pay for them. So, you know, the price come down, which did happen. That's great, but it's not as interesting as the real business side of things, where it was found to be worthwhile to use 3D to solve certain problems we're developing. And we could solve them more cheaply than before. So we became motivated to shoot 3D as soon as we could. We did. Although it's interesting, and this is going to play, I think, maybe later in our conversation, is through those early years, we spent a lot of time justifying 3D economically. Not only was there a reason, there was an economic reason, you had to prove it. And a lot of times we would spend trying to case how the 3D worked better than the 2D. And we really hammered this home everywhere we could, because we really wanted to be able to shoot that 3D. It wasn't a foregone conclusion at the time. But probably that doing this effort that happened, this evolution, probably developed a huge bias towards 3D seismic and against 2D, just in going through that process. Eric and I were talking about the fact that probably at the time in the 90s, geoscientists all over the world would wake up in a cold sweat, in a fever dream, saying, no, we have to have 3D. Now, this whole question of economics, it really becomes intertwined with geology. So we should go there. And maybe I've talked enough, and Eric should pick up on the geology side.
Sure, yeah, I can handle that. And like Lee said, there's no single answer to the question of why 2D went out of style. But I think something that we can't forget is that we have geology and we have a subsurface, and it's unique and distinct, and with that subsurface we have an evolution. And when we talk about evolutions, I just think of basins and basin exploration, and how development of basins, it invariably leads
2D to 3D. If we require data over a large scale basin to start understanding things, then we'll just focus on the petroleum and natural gas industry. But when you enter a basin and you're trying to understand some of the large considerations, like your 5 risk factors, and do we have traps set up, and all of these beautiful things which would lead to oil and gas discoveries, 2D was the tool at greenfield exploration. But invariably with time, our targets tend to get smaller, and we require more resolution in the interwell and inter 2D line spacing, and that is where 3D rose to prominence. So if we think of trying to understand structural complexity on a smaller scale as we're imaging smaller fields and smaller leads, that was where that tool rose to prominence, and it still sits there as the sort of the premier tool. Resource plays, which we've seen a huge amount of development onshore North America. We can just focus on that with their low porosity and permeability. And when we start to image some of the attributes of that, we all know when we're looking at frackability and these things which we're tracking in large swaths, the Montney play is a great example for that. They require highly certain, and that is where we start to see 3D come to prominence, and specifically high effort 3Ds that are being shot in North America. Developing those plays, if we're steering horizontal wells and we're avoiding features which we might intersect on those wells, say fracture systems where you'd lose mud and wellbores, that requires 3D and that level of imaging. And so 3D is a tool that we use to answer I would say smaller scale geologic considerations in a basin, but it basically, as we started to focus on play fairways and into the development opportunities for companies, we've tended away from 2D data because our questions that we were answering weren't as well suited for that, which is something we're seeing, which is a bit of a disparity with the CCS industry, which I think is probably where we're going to go to next.
That is an excellent hypothesis, Eric. So having said that, it sounds like 3D is pretty great. What has brought 2D back?
Circumstances. Eric was alluding to CCS, but really the circumstances in CCS are different. And here we're talking about economics again, actors involved, and scale. We have to always remember that seismic is a tool. Geophysics is in the service of geology. However we define geophysics is always kind of a set of methods that we use to solve geologic things, and the geology is the reason for geophysics, and it's the reason for the tools that we choose. Now, seismic may be a tool, but it's a tool sometimes in search of a task or a reason for use, and the circumstances define what the best tool is. So the first thing we point out is, and Eric has a lot of experience here, is that 2D sees a lot of use in international. Do you want to go back here, Eric, before I continue and just expand on that for a second?
Yeah, I think I can add a bit of color to that. One of the things we've seen with the with onshore North American oil and gas development, where that's progressed in the last 20 years, is we've basically exhausted. There should be some people that listen to this that are maybe not happy, but we've exhausted a lot of the conventional opportunities, and certainly the large scale conventional opportunities which once existed, say go back to the 60s and 70s. That opportunity space still exists in the international realm, and so we say, what 2D back again? We're mostly saying what's brought 2D back again onshore North America, because in the international space, 2D is still seeing a lot of usage. And I'll just paint a picture for that. When you go into a basin, I discovered, or I spoke about this beforehand, but when you enter a basin, some of the questions that you're trying to answer at a large scale when you enter it are there things such as, structural complexity, and oftentimes you don't know where to focus initially and where to site a 3D. So 2D is a very effective tool for regional exploration of areas where you'd want to focus some play-based exploration. So the international realm, it's seen a lot of usage, but definitely in Canada, that's fallen to the wayside more. And particularly in North America, we have a lot of wellbore penetrations, which does not that's not a scenario which it plays out in the international space where you can be dealing with, 100 townships and have, or areas of that side and have, just a few penetrations in it. Coming back to the CCS, it'll segue into it that we're dealing with those types of scenarios here in North America again, which kind of brings 2D back. So maybe Lee, that dovetails into you here next.
Right. Speaking about bringing 2D back and going back to the future, it's a little bit like in time here in Canada. And worth emphasizing for a second, Eric talked about the international world, a lot of it's offshore. When we at Carbon Alpha talk about CCS, we're really talking about onshore, particularly, of course, in Canada. And if we went to international conventions and they talked about carbon storage, they would have an emphasis very different than we would. And so it's important that we in Canada, North America, really understand that we are different. We've said that the tools have to match the circumstances. Our circumstances are different. And the answers that we're going to give, they don't necessarily offshore, but they do apply here. So like Eric said, the rise in CCS projects, and worldwide, there's something like 200 or so that we know of that are in progress. So this is a lot of projects suddenly. It's brought a real new emphasis in Canada and on land. And like Eric said, a lot of these are exploratory. They have, if you look at our recorder paper, and although it is well known, these storage complexes are also very large. Some of them are over 150, 170 townships in size. And we're thinking, how are we going to get an understanding of the gross fabric of structures and risks? This is a big area to cover. The other thing about, and this is the early stage of CCS, is sometimes you're looking at more than one area. You haven't decided, where am I going to invest? I've got a bunch of emission sites. I could try to bring it all to one place. What's the best place? How do I economically get after things? Because we do have to think about the economics. So Eric and I have talked about circumstances, the economics, the scale of CCS, really begging for 2D. But something that goes along with that is actors. And I used the word actors in one of my recorder papers, and it might have got edited out. It really kind of is controversial that we're calling project managers actors, but we are. We are actors. We are making things happen. And the thing is that the actors in CCS are not a monolithic group. This is a complicated group of people. Whereas before, the seismic users would have been exploration and production companies. Now this has changed. We have a variety of new industries, CCS being one of them, that maybe didn't have quite the background with seismic. And if I was a company like Shell, which had Quest or another E&P company, I'd have come with a legacy of data. Not only understanding how to use 2D and 3D historically, but I might have just owned a lot because I was using it for other things. But now I'm a new actor, say I'm a power plant company or a cement factory. It's very unlikely that those kinds of companies, even pipeline companies for that matter, are going to own a bunch of seismic data. And so for these people now, they've got these big areas. They're thinking about storing a lot of CO2. They got to cover a lot of subsurface, but no legacy data. So they got to build that up. And it's almost like starting all over in a new basin. How are you going to do that in a big area? You got to get a coarse grid of 2D. Where should I focus? Then maybe later you get into things like 3D. So it's very circumstantial.
It is. And Lee, I'm glad you mentioned people, because with 2D going away and then making a resurgence, the workforce has changed. And if I can quote from your article, we need 2D seismic for CCS, and not only do many modern geoscientists lack skills with 2D seismic, but their projects have conditioned them to devalue this type of data. So I'd like to explore that comment a little bit, if you would.
Okay. Yeah, Eric probably sees this in a different way than a lot of geoscientists who would just have North American experiences. If you look at the last, more than 10 years, all the work has been, most of the work, resource plays, and all the lessons and incredible details, uses of seismic and geology for resource plays. And this has been a great example of the kind of thing we were talking about where we get conditioned not to use 2D, because in resource plays, 2Ds have a very limited utility. The questions being answered are different. They're so detailed. So you spend all this time learning the tool, and now you have a different problem. Well, you're going to carry the burden of that learning. In a previous recorder paper, I think called Useful Mistakes from 2020 or 2021, we talked about cognitive biases, and one of them was Maslow's hammer. And that's the one where we get our favorite hammer and we use that hammer on everything, including trying to screw screws in. But really, you know, we can get used to using 3D. And so there's a psychological aspect of what's going on here. We learn a lesson and we sometimes misapply it. But there's some other really important psychological effects as well. One of them would be dealing with uncertainty. We all know that there's uncertainty in all seismic data. It's an experiment. The only things we ever get out of it are estimates, which is kind of an uncomfortable thing. And whenever possible, I believe we ignore that fact. And having 3D seismic does give us a sense of comfort for a lot of things in dealing with us uncertainty. Although we know that the imaging in 3D isn't perfect, we still get to use it, and we kind of feel like, you know, that it is good. Offline energy isn't a problem, which it is in 2D. It feels very comfortable. Now we're going to pick up the grid of 2D lines, and life changes. Now we are dealing with uncertainties in a very different way. The uncertainty bars are bigger. The size of them, the number of them has grown, and dealing with this could be very uncomfortable. And I think this affects people differently. Probably geoscientists that have had a great deal of experiences may have something to offer. They might remember dealing with this stuff before, some of them. And those with less experience might have something to learn about dealing with uncertainties to 2D. So there's a process that needs to happen. But our initial reaction would be, ooh, get that away from me. How am I going to solve this problem? Is, I think, natural.
Of course, you want to work with the biggest and the best. It's not always the most attractive option, even if it's the right tool to use. Yeah. So I will come back to your point about Maslow's hammer, but first I want to come back to something else you mentioned. In one of your other recorder articles, you mentioned project timelines and making a case for geoscience work being done before the final decision. So when in the project life does 2D come into play, and how long is it useful for?
Okay, we can answer that, but maybe we take a second. Eric, would you take a minute and just outline what the project stages are in CCS, so we can define what FID is and where that is?
Perfect. Yeah, and that's something that for those listeners or readers who haven't been initiated in the space or just learning about the space, one thing that you'll come up the curve on very quickly is that the CCS space, because of the risk aversion by necessity, projects are big and expensive. We've operated in a world which is what Lee and I kind of think is sort of like a facilities engineer type world where we're doing a lot of risk reduction. But what that's done is it's created a set of standards which are very useful guides for how these projects progress. And if you look at any of those standards, and we'll just reference, you know, the CSA Z741 standard, these projects walk through stages, you know, from start to end of screening, site selection, characterization, where you're acquiring site-specific data, and then they flow through towards development, ops, and closure. And there are types of data which are useful and leveraged at different stages in these projects. And so when we're talking about, CCS and when it comes into play, I think you know where we're going for this, but early on in the project, before we get to the development, ops, and closure is, Lee, you can dovetail into that, but this is where we see the most utility, but not all of the utility for CCS projects.
Yeah, and it's in those earliest stages that we really use public data. People will describe, say, site screening and site selection, those are the two earliest stages, respectively, as a duck exercise. Canada is really good for this in particular because most of our well information, completion information is available to everybody, small fee to get the data, but manage it. But we have that. And so you have this desktop exercise, and you even see papers in the conventions, GeoConvention had a few that were very interesting about sort of site screening selection style automatic methods that people would use using public data. And this is important because remember, we're talking early on, you may not be sure where you should put your hydrocarbons, you don't, or your CO2. You can't put the cart before the horse. You don't want to spend a fortune on, say, 3D and start drilling wells until you've looked at all the areas, decide where you're going to be. So it starts with public data. And as you work your way in, approaching this final investment decision where you decide this is the spot, I'm going to commit to it, you start slowly spending a little more money. And some of that could be on things like potential field data. Eventually, you start buying legacy seismic. And this could be 3D, but it's more often 2D because of the scale questions that we talked about. When you're in what we call the characterization phase, that's when we get a lot of seismic as cheaply as possible generally, and we even start to perhaps drill what we call appraisal wells. But there's a conundrum here around FID and how we go about doing these things. It's a business conundrum. In order to reach FID, we need certainty, okay? And that's why we're eventually getting things like seismic and drilling appraisal wells and getting logs. So we need that certainty so we can make our decision. However, business managers really do not like to be exposed on a project that might not go ahead. And that's why you start cheap and slowly start investing more. But even at the stage that you're getting your characterization, which you need to have to make this decision, because you're deciding how to develop a field, you have to know a lot of things about permeability, about how that reservoir is laid down, about the seal integrity, what the pressure limits, the geomechanics, you got all kinds of things. But how do you get that data? And so that's the characterization phase. But the conundrum is that you don't want to spend too much money because the business manager doesn't want to do that and not have the project go ahead. So this is something that really gets dealt with. And it's one of the reasons why 2D is so useful, because it's economic. And we've been talking about economics from the very first question. It is a major factor here. And this is on land, 2D fits a very good spot for us. However, Eric has alluded to the fact that, after FID, you may do other things. So after we get the FID, often we'll do things like shoot a baseline 3D. Some people will do it before, but if we are respecting our business conundrum, you really prefer to do it after. So they shoot this baseline 3D. It's probably the most expensive thing you ever do with seismic because you have to learn the most right then. Following this, you start developing the project, and later on, as the project's in an operate phase, you start MMV programs, and you actually have repeat seismic. And Eric also kind of hinted at this, is we think that 2D seismic could have a role in the repeat seismic as well.
You mentioned that you're working with some legacy data. Often it can be, some pretty old vintages of 2D data. What are some of the challenges in repurposing this 2D data that was originally shot with a different end goal and a different target in mind? How do you deal with that kind of data?
Is this recording being recorded in visual space as well as audio? This is part of my answer.
It is.
Okay, well, that's good, because in the visual space, as you were asking your question, Eric was laughing. And because there's a lot of fun answers to, what are the challenges of repurposing 2D? And one of the answers is often it isn't very good. In fact, from some of the best data that we've bought, most useful data has started off from a quality inspection QI stage incomprehensibly bad. So sometimes it isn't very good. Sometimes it hasn't even been reprocessed since it was shot, or at least reprocessed that the data owner can show you. So yeah, so sometimes it's not very good. Sometimes you're not sure how good you can make it. But to be more specific, it may have insufficient offsets. A lot of the ideal storage reservoir is deeper than most exploration. If CO2 is going to get get out of containment, which we want to make sure it doesn't. One of the most likely way that happens is because there's a wellbore into the storage complex, like an old wellbore, which has the consequence of making us prefer to store CO2 underneath everybody else's exploration, which has also of meaning the 2D data was shot for shallower things. So it's not likely to have long enough offsets for velocity analysis or multiple attenuation. Older data may have short fiber size sweeps, like those 1256 hertz sweeps that are so short. There was in the 80s the use of notch filters, where we were trying to filter out power line noise at 60 hertz. This is very problematic. So old data can have a lot of problems like this, and some of them we can address to a certain degree, completely, or not at all. So we have to do those things, and it's a technical problem, and you definitely want a geophysicist working on it, or someone with a lot of experience on that side of geosciences. And it's very important in making your plans and managing your project that these things are understood, and that issues are discussed, and that the interpretive goals of this data are realistic to the quality of the data. So you have to think about this and not make promises your data can't keep. Now, as part of this, at Carbon Alpha, when we're working for our clients or ourselves, we reprocess all legacy data that we license. Everything. We have to minimize the data issues. We have found that the value in the data is usually there, but sometimes it takes a lot of work to dig it out. We also audit all our surveys. We want to make sure our information is where we think it is. We have been keeping track of the statistics of the data that we've bought and whether the lines have proven useful to the task. And so far, about 99% of the lines that we've bought, even the ones that have been incomprehensibly bad, have actually been useful for our mapping. So it's very rare that we can't achieve our goals, even with the data with these problems. However, I'll preface that and say we do have a realistic idea of what we're trying to do with that data. Anyway, so those are challenges.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'd just dovetail into that as far as challenges, and Lee, you alluded to this, but we have to be, and I've just put a finer point on this, but we have to be very realistic in what we hope to achieve from the 2D data that we have. And so going back to the 3D and how, modern geoscientists, I won't say modern geoscientists, but geoscientists that have been working onshore for the last number of years that are conditioned to like 3D, the types of questions that you can answer with that data are not oftentimes the same questions that you can get out of the 2D, but we're actually asking a different set of questions than that. So if you're trying to do attribute analysis on a 3D, I think everyone knows on a 2D, that would be a stretch target, but we're not answering those same questions. We're really focusing on the suitability criterion for carbon storage complexes, and that they follow when they're answering some of the higher level considerations like structural complexity and breaches to the seal, which are things that we have a hope of imaging, not in 3D space, but we have a hope of imaging and identifying those features on 2D.
Gotcha. So we're setting expectations of what do we actually want to get from this data, and can it meet that criteria?
For sure.
Paige, I don't know if we want to still dive into this next one. We're going to ask what other challenges there are working with old data. Do we feel like we expand on it, or do we feel like it's been covered?
There's a couple quick things we might mention.
Okay,
Eric, thanks for that addition, by the way. It is the use that you put things through to that matters. But yeah, there are some other challenges in working with old data. We find them from time to time. Sometimes you buy a line or you want to buy a line and it has missing field data. So you got to go back to the horse and see what you can figure out. We also sometimes buy data, and they're very rarely there's a corruption in the field records. What people may not be old enough to even have experienced is we used to record this data on things like tapes, 9-track tapes, other things, and this stuff actually degrades over time. It can stick, and anyway, most of that has been copied onto digital media. However, sometimes that didn't work out because of the stuff falling apart, the tapes. So that can happen. The notch filters are really a problem. I just mentioned that because they make me mad. Also, and this is just kind of fun, is sometimes you run into some really old and esoteric sources. Somebody's weird rubber band gun was old, and you're trying to decide if there was enough energy in this rubber band gun. So you can have some challenges there. I'll just mention one more time here and close this question, is really old data that hasn't been reprocessed is the hardest thing to evaluate. Our 1% failure rate is coming out of data that, it's just very difficult to evaluate, and we took a chance on.
Doesn't sound easy, does it?
That's why there's two of us, right, Eric?
Correct.
So it has its challenges, but you do make a strong case for me and Eric for 2D. So what does this mean for 3D? Do you not like it? Do you just reserve that for later? How do you decide which data type is more useful at which point in a project? How do you approach that?
Well, we love 3D. I mean, we shouldn't be emotional, but we are. We love 3D. We try to put that aside. We decide on what data to use depending on the task in front of us. We talked about circumstances, the motivation for murders and murder of 2D, but it's also the motivation of what we're trying to do that's motivated. Most of the time, Eric, would you agree that the data type that we're going to use is obvious?
I think so. Yeah, the problems that we're answering in the stage of the projects that are currently being worked, I'd say, yeah, the data type is obvious. I would preface that with the fact that we're always wrapping this up in the construct of economics, which Lee spoke about beforehand. There are places in the world, basins in which I've worked, where 3Ds are publicly available, and you'd buy them from the oil and gas regulator, and they can be purchased at a very low cost, and that flips the script onshore. But that's a very unique scenario which doesn't happen here. I would say, yeah, the data type is fairly obvious.
Yeah, and even though that's the case, one of the things Eric and I talk about cognitive bias all the time. It's still possible. Just you think it's obvious, so you don't think. We've been working on a proprietary MMV design that takes a real critical look at seismic data types and which you should use and why, what their intentions are. And in doing so, we've forced ourselves to ask some pretty sharp questions and not accept the common wisdom that is still being said in conventions now. So it's worth stopping, looking at our assumptions and thinking carefully, and maybe saying maybe it's not so obvious.
So does that mean 2D is here to stay, or is it going to lose popularity again once projects move into the operational stage? Is the geoscientists going to get their heart broken once again?
Well, we always get our heart broken, right, Eric?
Yeah, daily.
Yeah, we're laughing at the word popularity. We've said many times, we've said emotional things in this interview. We're not going to try to pick on you for using the word popularity. We said we love 3D. We know you're talking about the use, the frequency of 2D is used, and that's what we mean by popular. But really, these data types, 3D or 2D, they're just different data, and they have different trade-offs. We've got to, as good advisors to whoever we serve, talk about which data type is most appropriate from all the perspectives that are relevant. It isn't personal. I know I've contradicted myself, but it isn't personal. We have to resist our emotions. We, however, think 2D is not going like it did. It has some very particular uses, we kind of alluded, even in the later stages in MMV, and we've got something we're cooking at Carbon Alpha. We think 2D could be have a role that'll be very strong and durable.
I think we can also, just to add some color into what Lee's saying, if we're to look at the macro scale of what's happening in the CCS space, what we see is that as we march towards net zero and 2050, the growth in the storage space has to be exponential. And so right now, what we're seeing with projects is that as they're being developed out right now, they're exploratory projects, and in this exploration phase, what we're advocating for here are the site selection, and into the development phase, you'd use 2D. And the question being, as these projects get more operational, do we see that shift, and does this just die out? I think if we're just looking at, say, the 200 projects, which, are on the books today, you could say, oh, as these transition into operations, you use less 2D, even though we'd advocate there's still utility for it later on, what we're working on internally. But what we see is that more and more projects exponentially have to be added into the CCS sphere, and because of that, we are going to have to continually do more and more exploration. And so I think as long as, I guess, in a world where there's no major shift where 3D just becomes free and cheap, like the basins I was representing before, the 2D and CCS is going to have a long life. So.
We certainly hope so.
Yes.
Yes, we do. So Lee, you had mentioned emotion, and you brought that up a few times, and bias. So what does it mean about technical and cognitive flexibility? Something you've written about. And in some of your articles, you've spoken about cognitive biases, such as anchoring, confirmation bias, and we mentioned earlier Maslow's hammer. Can you give us a quick explanation of what these concepts are and how they play into the CCS industry and the skills needed to enter it?
Sure. So Maslow's hammer we talked about a little bit before. We tend to overuse our favorite tool and use it for the wrong things. So that one, I think, isn't too painful to talk about. Anchoring, sort of kind of similar. Anchoring, Kahneman talks about all of these a lot, by the way. But anchoring is sort of just idea. The first number you hear, you have trouble getting off it. So if we're anchored on 3D, it's hard to think about 2D and lots of things like that. We do get anchored. Confirmation bias is a little more complicated. It's where we set ourselves up to confirm our own ideas, and we do, all of us. But what's worse is also where we denigrate information that's contrary to those ideas. I've had some experience with that, and it sucks. So those are the three biases we talk about. And a lot of people talk about biases, like Eric and I have lots of conversations about it. And one of the things that's a little irritating is that if you're at a cocktail party and people are talking cognitive biases, or if you're on Facebook for that matter, it tends to be used as a hammer against others. We'll point out how someone else's cognitive bias is stupid, and they're stupid too. But that isn't the purpose of understanding psychology. It's not to beat up on other people. It's to help ourselves. We want to understand our biases so that we make better decisions. And going back to how does this tie into the CCS industry and the skills needed, we need to be able to be nimble. We need to be nimble-minded And we've talked a lot about our own emotionality, and being nimble is easier said than done. We are human beings, and we often like to consider that certain questions are answered. Use this here and that there and move on. And you don't need to evaluate problems. But we do need to evaluate problems, and often quickly. So there's a contradiction here that we don't want to feel like we completely own all the answers, but certainty of technique can be important. We're in this bit where we have to make quick evaluations. But one thing we've also said is you just can't be wrong fast enough. It's almost always worth taking a breath. We do work in an industry where thinking is valuable. And so keeping our minds open to changes in circumstances is important too. Taking that breath, ask a challenging question. It's not only nice, but it's incredibly freeing. We have to be free to admit we're wrong, because when we do that, we give ourselves the freedom to improve.
So at SeisWare, we always say, this is my story, ask for validation and different inputs. Is that something you do in your own work to try and identify your own biases?
You know, it's an interesting thing. It's been talked about whether we, just because we know about a bias, can we be inoculated against it? And Kahneman, if he was here, would say no. I'm pretty sure. He's talked about it in papers. In order to minimize the effects that biases have on you, you have to set up a process where you ask yourself questions. And if that's part of your process at SeisWare, that you're forced to maybe take a look at what you said in your story, that's great. But yeah, we need to have processes. And at Carbon Alpha, we have a lot of meetings where we beat the hell out of each other and not take it personally. We write things, and everything we write are reviewed and criticized, and we tell each other we like it.
I'm sure it's very constructive, though.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
That's great. So we're coming up in the hour here. Are there any final thoughts? I feel like, 2D was, maybe we brought out the paddles today and brought it back to life. Is there any advice you have for people who are just starting to work with this data type, or anything we might have missed today?
Right. Well, this bit about how it can be discomforting because the information is different. Would just say take it a step at a time. Remember what you're trying to do, trying to solve some bigger questions with it. Hopefully we're putting appropriate problems in front of an appropriate tool. And, so construct a process for yourself that you understand, and that probably work to de-escalate the feelings of anxiety that could come from it. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head, Lee. I think that anybody who's entering the CCS space, or even on oil and gas projects where they're sort of stepping out of their comfort zone and they don't have 3D, I think really it takes you should take a second to step back and really frame the problem that you're trying to understand, and looking at that circumstance and what you can get out of it. I think will help you, and yeah, you'll get over the hurdle of the discomfort that you're carrying more uncertainty and risk into your project. But if you really frame what you're trying to get out of it, yeah, you'll get over it.
The other thing is pick on people's skills. Our industry is full of very smart, skilled people. The actors at the power companies, the cement companies, the pipeline companies that have some of these CCS projects, they are good decision makers. We will all solve these problems. And part of solving it is to draw upon the things we already know. You'd mentioned the Recorder article, one that's, I think, will have come out on September 7th, is about using what you've already learned and applying it to CCS, and the same would be with 2D. We know a lot of things about 3D. How can we apply that to 2D? If we do those things all on our strengths appropriately, we'll be okay.
Well, on that optimistic note, we'll come to our end of our Back to the Future episode. So I think we covered a lot of ground today. I want to thank you all for joining us on this journey through time, and especially thank you guys, Eric and Lee, for sharing your perspectives and giving us a lot of optimism for the future.
Yay.
Yay, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.